At my sister's wedding, in front of 200 guests, my mother took the microphone during the toasts, gestured toward me at my little table near the kitchen, and said, "And of course we have Delia. We adopted her, she's not really family by blood, but we've always been so charitable." 200 people laughed the polite, uncomfortable laugh of people who don't know what else to do. I set down my glass. I stood up. And I said, "Since we're telling the truth tonight, Mom, there's something Grandma asked me to say at exactly this kind of moment." The room went quiet. My mother's smile flickered. She had no idea what was coming, because she'd never once bothered to ask what her own mother had told me before she died. Let me back up. My name is Delia Ashford. I'm 31 years old, and I was 5 when the Ashfords adopted me. And for 26 years, I was raised inside a family that never let me forget I was a guest in it. I want to be careful how I tell this, because adoption is a beautiful thing, and there are millions of adoptive families who love without an asterisk. Mine was not one of them, and that's not a statement about adoption. It's a statement about Margaret Ashford, my adoptive mother, who took in a 5-year-old and then spent 26 years using that fact as both a halo and a leash. The halo was for other people. Margaret loved to be seen as charitable. At dinner parties, at church, at her club, she was the woman who'd opened her home to a child who had no one. And she told the story often, in my presence, in a way that positioned herself as a saint and me as the evidence of her sainthood. I was, functionally, a prop in the ongoing performance of Margaret's goodness. The leash was for me, because in private, and in 100 small, deniable public ways, Margaret made sure I understood the terms. I was allowed to be there. I was not entitled to be there. Her 2 biological children, my sister Vivian, 3 years older, and my brother Grant, 5 years older, were family. I was charity. When there was inheritance talk, it was for the children, and we'll make sure Delia's taken care of too, of course. That, of course, landing every time like a coin dropped in a cup. When Vivian and Grant made mistakes, they were forgiven as family. When I made mistakes, there was always a shadow of but after everything we did for her. Here's the first scene that tells you everything. I was 9. It was Christmas. Vivian and Grant had stacks of presents, and I had a respectable pile too. Margaret was careful about optics. But at the bottom of my stack was a wrapped gift, and when I opened it, it was a framed copy of my adoption certificate. Margaret had framed my adoption papers and given them to me as a Christmas present, and she said, beaming in front of the whole extended family, "So you never forget how lucky you are." I was 9. I said thank you. Everyone said how touching. And I understood at 9 that I was going to spend my life being reminded of the debt. There was exactly one person in that family who never made me feel like charity. My grandmother, Margaret's mother, Eleanor. Grandma Eleanor was the one who saw it, from the beginning. She was old and sharp, and she'd watched her daughter Margaret grow into exactly the kind of woman who'd frame a child's adoption papers, and Eleanor did not approve, and Eleanor was the only person in the family Margaret was even slightly afraid of. Grandma was the one who taught me to garden, who kept my drawings, who introduced me to her friends as my granddaughter Delia with no asterisk. No, of course. No story about charity, just my granddaughter, full stop, in a voice that dared anyone to add a footnote. When I was 16, and I overheard Margaret telling a friend that I'd never really bonded these adopted ones sometimes can't. It was Grandma Eleanor I called sobbing. Grandma, who drove 40 minutes at night to sit with me and say the sentence I have carried my whole life. "Delia, you are not the least loved person in this family. You are the most loved. It's just that the love with the loudest voice in this house belongs to a small woman, and small people are loud. Mine is quieter, but mine is real, and mine is going to outlast hers. You'll see. I've made sure of it." I didn't know what she meant by "I've made sure of it." Not then. Grandma Eleanor died when I was 28, and her death is where this story really turns, though it took 3 years and a wedding for the turn to complete. When Eleanor died, there was a will, and the will was read, and it was, on its face, unremarkable. Eleanor had left the bulk of her estate divided among her descendants, with Margaret as executor. Vivian and Grant received generous bequests. I received, per the Reed will, a modest amount in Grandma's gardening tools, and a note that said, "For my Delia, who knows why." Margaret, executing the estate, made a great show of how generous Mother was to Delia, even considering. That, of course, again. I grieved my grandmother, and I took her gardening tools, and I assumed that was the end of it. I was wrong. Because Eleanor Ashford had not survived 84 years, and outlasted a husband and a difficult daughter, by being naive about how Margaret would handle her estate. Here is what I didn't know for 3 years. Before she died, Eleanor had done something. She'd gone to her own attorney, not the family attorney, not Margaret's contact, a lawyer of her own, and she'd set up a separate trust. And she left instructions with that lawyer, and a letter for me, to be delivered not upon her death, but upon a specific triggering condition. Eleanor, who knew her daughter to the bone, had predicted that Margaret would eventually humiliate me publicly, badly, at a family event, because Margaret always did, and Eleanor had watched it for 26 years. And Eleanor had decided that the moment Margaret did it one time too, many was exactly the moment the truth should come out. So Eleanor's lawyer had a standing instruction. If Delia ever contacted him and reported a specific kind of public humiliation by Margaret, he was to deliver the letter and execute the trust. Grandma had built me a trapdoor, and she'd handed me the key, and she'd told me in that note, "For my Delia, who knows why, to wait." I hadn't understood the note. I'd assumed it was sentiment. It was instructions. I found out what it meant 8 months before Vivian's wedding, when Eleanor's private lawyer, a quiet man named Mr. Okafor, contacted me on the 3rd anniversary of her death, a check-in he'd apparently been instructed to make. He asked me, gently, how things were in the family. And something made me tell him the truth, and he said, "Miss Ashford, your grandmother left something with me. She was very specific about when you should receive it. I think it may be time we spoke properly." What Alina had left me changed the shape of everything, and I'm going to tell you exactly what it was because it's the heart of the story. First, the letter. In it, Alina told me the truth about the estate. The will that had been read, the one where I got a modest amount, even considering, reflected the assets Margaret knew about. But Alina had quietly moved the most valuable thing she owned into the separate trust years before she died, the lake property. 200 acres of lakefront land that had been in Alina's family for a century that Margaret coveted more than anything on earth that Margaret had assumed she was inheriting, and that Alina, in the Reed will, had listed as already disposed of prior to death. A line Margaret had glossed over assuming it meant sold. It wasn't sold. It was in the trust, and the trust's sole beneficiary was me. Grandma Alina had left the crown jewel of the family, the land Margaret had spent her whole life expecting, to the adopted daughter Margaret called Charity. And she left it in a structure Margaret couldn't touch, couldn't contest, couldn't even find, executed by a lawyer Margaret didn't know existed. And she'd instructed me to reveal it only when Margaret humiliated me publicly one final time, so that the revelation would land not as a quiet legal fact, but as justice, witnessed. Your grandmother, Mr. Acafer told me, said, and I'm quoting her instructions, Margaret will do it at some big event in front of everyone because she can't help herself. When she does, Delia is to stand up and tell the truth, not before. Let Margaret show the whole room who she is first. Grandma knew, 3 years dead, and she knew her daughter would do it, and she knew where, and she was right. The wedding was Vivian's, 200 guests. Country club, all the trimmings, Margaret in her element as mother of the bride, radiant with the specific joy of a woman whose real family was being celebrated properly. I'd been invited, of course. Margaret would never risk the optics of excluding me, and I'd been seated, as always, at the periphery. A small table near the kitchen doors, with the distant cousins and a coworker of Grant's. The charity table. I almost didn't go. I want you to know that. I sat in my car in the parking lot with Alina's letter in my purse, and I thought about just driving home and letting the land be a quiet thing I owned, and never telling any of them, living well and silently. That was a real option, and part of me still wishes I were the kind of person who'd have taken it. But then I thought about Grandma driving 40 minutes at night to sit with a sobbing 16-year-old. I thought about mine is going to outlast hers, I've made sure of it, and I understood that walking away wasn't peace, it was letting Margaret win the story one last time. Grandma hadn't built this trapdoor so I could tiptoe past it. She built it so I could open it, so I went in. The toasts came after dinner. The best man, the maid of honor, the father of the bride. And then Margaret took the microphone because Margaret always took the microphone. She gave a lovely speech about family and blood and legacy, and then, because she couldn't help herself exactly as her mother predicted, she gestured toward my table near the kitchen and delivered the line. And of course we have Delia. We adopted her, you know. Not really family by blood, but we've always been so charitable. 200 people did the polite, horrified laugh, and I stood up. Since we're telling the truth tonight, Mom, I said, and my voice carried across that silent room, there's something Grandma Alina asked me to say at exactly this kind of moment. She knew you'd do this. She told me before she died that you'd humiliate me publicly one day in front of everyone, because you always did, and she left instructions for what I should say when you finally did it. So here it is. Margaret's smile had frozen. Delia, sit down. Grandma left a letter, I continued, with her own attorney. A man named Mr. Acafer. You don't know him because Grandma made sure of that, and in it she told me the truth about her estate. The lake property, Mom, the 200 acres you've been telling people you inherited. The land that's been in Grandma's family for 100 years. I watched the color leave my mother's face. It was never sold. Grandma moved it into a private trust years before she died. She left it to one person. She left it to me, the adopted one. The charity. She left the thing you wanted most in the world to the daughter you just told 200 people isn't really family. The room made a sound, a collective intake of breath. Somewhere a chair scraped. She left me a letter to read at a moment like this, I said, and I took it out, and I read Grandma's own words aloud to the room. Delia is my granddaughter. Fully, completely, without an asterisk, and more mine than anyone in this family has earned the right to claim. I watched my daughter Margaret treat a child as charity for 26 years, and I said what I could, but small, loud people don't listen to the quiet. So I'm saying it now, in a way that cannot be argued with. The land goes to Delia. The love always did. Margaret, you had a daughter you refused to see as your own. She was the best of us. And you gave her away twice, once a charity and once by never looking at her. This is what it cost you. You could have heard a pin drop on the dance floor. Here's how it ended, and it ended the way Grandma engineered it, completely, and in public, so it could never be spun. Margaret tried, of course. She tried to contest the trust, and discovered it was airtight, structured by a careful lawyer specifically to survive her. She tried to tell people I'd manipulated a dying old woman, and discovered that Alina had recorded a video statement with Mr. Acafer, sound of mind, explaining exactly why she was doing it, which existed precisely to defeat that accusation. Grandma had thought of everything, because Grandma had spent 84 years learning how her daughter operated. But the land was never really the point. The point was the room. 200 people, Margaret's friends, her club, her church, the entire audience for whom she performed her charity and her sainthood for decades, had now heard, in a dead woman's own words, exactly what Margaret was. A performance that had cost me my childhood was demolished in 90 seconds in front of everyone whose opinion Margaret had built her life around. She spent 26 years using my adoption to make herself look generous. Grandma made sure the whole audience found out all at once that the generous one had been the child. Vivian, to her credit, and this surprised me, found me after. She was crying. She said, I never stood up for you, not once. I was a coward my whole life about Mom and you. It wasn't much, But it was the first time in 31 years a sibling had claimed me out loud, and I took it. Grant never came around. Some people are too invested in the old story. That's the realistic part. And Margaret and I don't speak. She sent word through Grant that she'd forgive me if I signed the land back to the family, where it belongs. I did not respond. The land is mine. I built a small house on it, near the water, where Grandma taught me to garden. Her gardening tools are in the shed. I use them. Some inheritances are money, and some are land, and some are 200 acres of lakefront a grandmother spent years hiding from her own daughter, so that a 5-year-old she chose would have a place that was hers by right and not by charity. Margaret told 200 people I wasn't really family. My grandmother had already made sure that history would record exactly whose family it was.